In today's note, we're going to be looking at current electricity. So everything that we've looked at, all the charging methods, those have been static electricity, where the charges are resting on a surface. Current electricity is a little different, and so we're going to look at that today, and it's also going to be an introduction to simple circuits. So you just mentioned static electricity. So the difference between static electricity and current electricity. Static electricity, what we've looked at, is the stationary buildup of electric charge on a substance. And the characteristics of that are electrons do not move on a path. They may move from one object to another when we're charging, whether it's friction, conduction, induction, but they're not moving along a path. They're stationary on an object. Current electricity, what we're going to be looking at in the second half of the unit, starting today, current electricity is where the electric charge moves from a source of electrical energy along a controlled path in an electric current. And electrons move along a path are the characteristics. So basically, you could think of it as kind of like a river, where the electrons are the water and they're moving along that water, whereas static electricity would be, say, water in a cup. Right, so it's stationary, it's not moving. The current, you could think of current water, it's moving along a path. So that's the difference between the two. Circuits. So basically, we're going to be looking at circuits is the main primary example for current electricity. So current electricity is basically, again, the controlled flow of electrons through a conductor. We've mentioned conductors before. It's objects that allow electrons or an electric charge to pass through it. A dry cell is a source of energy. So what we see here is the representation of a dry cell. We see a long line and a short line, and they're paired up. So for every one long line and short line pair, you have one cell. Basically, the long line represents a positive end, and the negative, or the short or the small line represents the negative end. And you can group them up into cells. And when you have two or more cells, you have basically what we call a battery. So a battery is basically a collection of two or more cells, and they're the source of the electrical charge. Again, in circuits are a closed path for electrons. So again, remember, current electricity is where the electrons flow along a path. A circuit is that closed path for electrons to flow on or flow through. The four main parts of a simple circuit. So again, that closed path. One, a source, something that provides power. So example, a battery, which we just mentioned. Control, so something that opens and closes the circuit. So for example, a switch, right, like a light switch or just a switch or a button, something that opens and closes it. The load converts one type of energy, in this case electrical, into another, whether it's sound, light, heat. Right, so you could think of like a light bulb, a heater, a buzzer, anything like that. And the conductor basically allows the electrical energy to pass through it. So for example, copper wire. So again, we talked about conductors previously at the very beginning of the unit. Conductors are, again, materials that allow electrical or electrons to pass through it. So this is an example of a simple circuit. Right? We have our source in 1, or our battery. We have our control in 2, so our switch, something that opens and closes the circuit. We have our load in 3, so that is an electrical diagram for a lamp or a light bulb. And 4, we have a conductor. We have conductors actually all around the straight lines representing the wires. So the operation of an electric circuit. So how do the electric circuits run, or how do they operate? There are two ways. One, a closed circuit. So a closed circuit means that the circuit is operating and the current is flowing and the switch is on. So if it's closed, that means the pathway is closed. That means the electrons are allowed to flow. They can flow through that pathway. An open circuit means that the circuit is not operating and the current is not flowing and the switch is off. So this is where you would see a break in the circuit where the electrons wouldn't be able to flow along that continuous path. So right now, looking at the same example of the simple circuit, this is an example of an open circuit. We can see that it's open because, we got a little laser pointer here. We see here this is open, the switch is off, so that means that the electrons cannot flow along this path. There is an opening on the path. So this is an open circuit, so that means that the electrons aren't flowing and the switch is off. If I do close that circuit, so I've flipped my switch, or I've pressed my button, whatever it happens to be, it's closed the circuit, it's completed the pathway, so now electrons are allowed to travel through. So we'll see the electrons start to travel through. So it continues. As it crosses the load, the load changes that electrical energy of the electrons going through and converts it into something else. In this case, we can see our nice light is being lit up now, and then the electrons go back into the cell, into the opposite end. So again, and then it's not just one electron, it's a continuous path, so the electrons will go back in and more electrons will come out the negative end and continue through and so on. So this would be constantly running until we flipped our switch and turned it off. So that is the general idea of a simple circuit, the difference between open and closed. So the general operation, let me just turn off laser pointer. The general operation of an electric circuit. So the electric current flows in a continuous loop from the negative terminal of the cell, which we saw was the small end, through the wires, the switch, and the light bulb, and then returns to the positive terminal. So again, it's a continuous flow. It's not just one electron. That was just more for a visual, but it's a constant flow of electric current or electrons through the wire, through the entire circuit. And then when it passes through the light bulb converts that electrical energy into another form. Just some general symbols to recognize when we're looking at circuits. So if we were to draw a circuit, or if we had to look at a circuit and we had to see what we were looking at, there are basically some symbols that we need to identify. So we have a conducting wire, which is a straight line. If we join wires, so they're connected, or different wires connected, we have the two lines with a circle over it, so it's showing that they're connected. If they're not joined and they're just overlapped, you just see the two lines, you don't see that circle. The cell that we talked about, actually let me get my laser pointer. The cell we talked about previously, again, this is an example of one cell. If we have two or more, we have a battery. So here we have the negative end, which is the short end, and the positive end, which is the longer end. The electrons are going to leave the negative end, go through, and come back into the positive end. This is just our lamp, which we've seen. A resistor, which we'll talk about later. It looks kind of like that jagged line. And then lastly, we have a switch, which we've talked about. Basically, it's just showing that in this case, the switch is open, if it closes, it comes down and it completes the path. A voltmeter, this is something that measures volts. Basically, this would be attached across a certain section of the wire. And same with an ammeter, this measures the current. So that would be placed again across or alongside a certain part of the wire, and the electrons or the electrical charge would flow through it. And then you would be able to measure the current. Same with the voltmeter. So again, just looking at an introduction to simple circuits, understanding the basic principles of them, and what some of the diagrams look like when drawing a circuit.